It was not the storm. I want to take that off the table immediately, because you have already assumed it, and every other video on this channel has trained you to. There was no rogue wave. Nothing broke. No rigging came down. No keel came off. No hull was breached. The engine worked. The boat was not sinking. She was not taking on water. She was not even damaged. When the United States Coast Guard helicopter lifted 3 men off her deck 154 miles southeast of Cape Hatteras and turned for shore, the crew looked back and saw a 59-foot ocean-going yacht sitting upright on her lines, with her sails neatly furled, doing absolutely nothing wrong. She was worth around $225,000. She was rated by her builder for unlimited ocean service. She had already crossed the Atlantic once with the same owner aboard, and they left her there floating and flew away. She drifted off east, unmanned, in the general direction of Europe. So this last video in the series is not about a disaster. There isn't one. It is about the thing that took a perfectly good boat away from 3 competent enough men in reasonable weather. A mechanism that does not appear in any casualty statistic, that no equipment protects you from, and that I would argue is the most under-discussed danger in offshore sailing. And I am going to be careful with these men, because they are alive, they are named, and the sailing world was extremely hard on them. The boat was called Yacht, Austrian-flagged, a Beneteau Oceanus 523, built in 2005. You will see her described as both a 53-footer and a 59-footer, and both are right. The hull is around 53 feet, and the overall length with the bowsprit is nearer 59. What matters more than the number is the category. She was rated CE Category A. In the European classification system, Category A means offshore, unlimited, designed for winds above force 8 and significant wave heights above 4 meters. It is the highest rating there is. A boat with that certification is, by design and by regulation, intended for exactly the conditions that arose. She was not a coastal cruiser that had wandered too far. She was a proper ocean boat. Her owner was a man named Thomas Hagspiel, and Yacht was not a weekend project. According to the Voyage's own website, she had set out in 2023 to sail around the world: southern France, the Balearics, Gibraltar, Madeira, the Canaries, across to the Caribbean, then onward to the Galapagos, the Marquesas, the South Pacific, and eventually the Cape of Good Hope. Hagspiel had already crossed the Atlantic in her, sailing with the ARC, the Atlantic Rally for Cruisers, the organized transatlantic passage that several hundred boats make together every November. So this is not a man who bought a boat and pointed it at the ocean. This is somebody 2 years into a circumnavigation with an ocean crossing already behind him. Aboard with him were 2 other men, described in reporting as paying crew, people who join a passage and contribute to costs, which is an entirely normal way for a short-handed skipper to get an extra pair of hands. 3 men, 1 large, capable, highly rated ocean yacht. On Sunday, the 8th of December 2024, Yacht left Hampton Roads and headed out into the Atlantic. Where this comes from: the operational facts, the timeline, the units launched, the position, the hoist, come from the United States Coast Guard's own press release from the 5th District, and from the footage their aircrew recorded. The analysis, and most of the detail about the boat and the decision, comes from Peter Swanson, a veteran yachting journalist, writing on loose cannon, whose reporting was then picked up across the sailing press. The naval architect quoted later is Tad Roberts, a Canadian designer, whose assessment appeared in that reporting. There was no formal investigation, nobody died, nobody was hurt, and there is no accident report to work from. That means everything about why. This happened is inference, some of it very well-informed inference by people who know these boats, but inference, I will keep flagging it. By Wednesday, the 11th of December, 3 days out, Yacht was 154 nautical miles southeast of Cape Hatteras and in heavy weather. Cape Hatteras is worth a sentence of its own. It is one of the more consequential pieces of water in the world, and it has a nickname, the graveyard of the Atlantic, that it earned honestly over centuries with something in the region of 1,000 recorded wrecks. It is where the warm Gulf Stream running north meets colder water coming south, over shifting shoals, and the interaction of those two makes seas there steeper and more confused than the wind alone would suggest. The mechanism is the same one that killed people in the Fastnet, and it is worth restating because it explains why the sea state around Hatteras is so consistently out of proportion to the forecast. When wind blows across current that is running the other way, the waves get shorter, steeper, and closer together. They stop being long rolling swells that a boat rises over and become walls with hollow backs that a boat falls off. The Gulf Stream runs northeast at up to 4 knots. Put a December northerly on top of that, and you get seas that are, in the sailor's phrase, standing up, steep, breaking, and arriving from angles that make no sense. That is why the professional advice about that stretch of coast in winter is so blunt. It is not that the wind is worse there, it is that the water is. In December, it is worse still. Roberts made exactly that point in his assessment. Cape Hatteras in December is late in the year to be out there. At 3 o'clock that Wednesday afternoon, Coast Guard Sector Charleston notified the 5th District Command Center that Time Yacht was caught in heavy weather and at risk of capsizing. And here is the first detail that makes this case unusual. The crew told the Coast Guard they were not in distress. That is a specific and meaningful statement in maritime terms. Declaring distress means declaring grave and imminent danger and requesting immediate assistance. Saying you are not in distress means, this is unpleasant, we are managing, we want you to know where we are. They stayed in that state through Wednesday afternoon, through Wednesday night, and into Thursday morning. Then, early on Thursday the 12th, the men aboard Time Yacht requested to abandon their vessel. The Coast Guard response was immediate and substantial. An HC-130 Hercules, a 4-engined long-range search aircraft, launched from Air Station Elizabeth City. An MH-60 Jayhawk helicopter launched from the same station, and the Coast Guard cutter Richard Snyder, a 154-foot vessel based at Atlantic Beach, North Carolina, was directed to respond. The Hercules and the Jayhawk were on scene at 9:30 in the morning. By 10 o'clock, all 3 men had been hoisted off the deck and were in the helicopter. No injuries, not one. And then everybody flew home, and the boat stayed. It is worth pausing on what that actually means, because it is a category of problem this channel has now covered from the other end. An abandoned yacht does not simply cease to exist. She becomes a derelict, an unlit, unmanned, 59-foot fiberglass object drifting in a busy stretch of the North Atlantic, invisible to radar in any meaningful sea state, showing no lights at night, with nobody aboard to answer a radio call. For a ship, she is barely a hazard. For another yacht, hitting her at night would be catastrophic, and striking an unidentified floating object is one of the standing explanations offered whenever a small boat disappears without trace, including in cases in this very series. She would have taken on water eventually, or been found and salvaged, or gone down. Reporting at the time noted, with some dark humor, that her drift was setting her towards Europe. Nobody had any obligation to go and get her. That is the position in law and in practice. Once you are off and safe, the vessel is your problem financially and nobody else's operationally, which is precisely the situation ACOA's owners found themselves in on a beach in Mallorca, from the opposite direction. A boat that has stopped being an asset and started being a liability with a hull number. The footage is the reason this case became an argument rather than a news item. The Coast Guard released video shot from the helicopter, as they routinely do, and what the sailing world saw when they watched it was not a stricken vessel. They saw a large white yacht sitting upright, sails furled, moving with the sea rather than fighting it, with no visible damage, no list, and nothing obviously wrong. Peter Swanson's description of what the aircrew could see as they left was a boat floating on her lines, sails furled, drifting away east. The reaction was immediate, and it was not kind. The Coast Guard's own statement described the conditions at the time of the rescue as winds of up to 20 knots and seas of around 10 feet. 20 knots is a brisk day. It is a nice sail. It is the sort of wind where an experienced crew on a 53-foot boat puts a reef in and enjoys themselves. Tad Roberts, the naval architect, put the professional view plainly. Capsizing seemed unlikely in those stated conditions, while being honest enough to add that he had not been there. Now, in fairness, and this matters, the conditions at the moment of the hoist are not the conditions of the preceding days. Other reporting describes the weather in the run-up as winds up to 40 knots with seas breaking above 10 feet. 40 knots is a gale. 2 days of gale conditions on a lee shore adjacent stretch of the Atlantic in December is genuinely grim. Both accounts can be true. One describes Thursday morning. The other describes Tuesday and Wednesday. The Coast Guard was reporting what its aircrew found when they arrived, and by then the worst had passed. Which is, as we will see, Precisely the point, and the thing that almost nobody in the argument grasped. Then there was the fuel. Hagspiel gave two reasons for requesting evacuation: fear that the boat would capsize, and the fact that they were running low on fuel. That second one drew more criticism than the first. Yacht carried fuel tanks reported at around 198 gallons. To be low on fuel 3 days into an ocean passage implies the tanks were not full on departure, and running out of fuel on a sailing boat is not, in itself, an emergency. She had a full sail wardrobe. She was a sailing yacht in a good breeze. But you can see how it happens. In heavy weather, short-handed, with an autopilot drawing power, and an exhausted crew who do not want to hand steer, the engine runs to charge batteries and to hold the boat's head up in the worst of it. It gets used far more than anyone planned. The number on the gauge drops fast, and nobody is doing arithmetic. So we arrive at the question everybody asked, which is, why? There is no report to answer it, so what follows is the best informed inference available, and it comes from people who design and sail these boats. The single most persuasive account came from Tad Roberts, and it identified something no piece of equipment aboard could have fixed. His reading was this: a big, beamy boat with a quick, snappy motion, a crew too small for the conditions, the one genuinely experienced person worn out after several days, and at that point, they give up. Let me unpack each part, because together they describe a failure mode that is far more common than any of the mechanical ones this channel has covered. Start with the motion. A modern production cruiser of that size is designed with a wide beam carried well aft, which produces enormous interior volume, huge cabins, a vast saloon, the space that sells boats at a boat show. It also produces a particular kind of rolling. A beamy hull has high initial stability, which means it resists heeling and then snaps back hard, in a confused sea that translates into a fast, jerky, unpredictable motion. That motion is not dangerous. It is exhausting. Every single movement you make aboard, standing, sitting, using a toilet, opening a locker, requires bracing. You cannot put anything down. You cannot walk without holding on. Sleep becomes a series of interruptions in which you are wedged against a lee cloth being thrown around. Now add the crew number. 3 people on a 53-foot boat is thin. It sounds like plenty until you divide it into watches, and then it means everybody is on for a third of every 24 hours indefinitely, with the skipper effectively on call for all of it. Do the arithmetic properly, because it is worse than it sounds. A 3-person rotation gives each person 4 hours on and 8 off, which looks generous on paper. It is not, because the 8 hours off are not 8 hours of sleep. You come off watch soaked and cold. You have to get out of foul weather gear in a space that is moving violently. You need to eat, and cooking in a gale is a two-handed job done one-handed. You need the heads. By the time you are horizontal, you have perhaps 5 hours, in a bunk that is throwing you around, in a hull that is booming every time it lands off a wave, with an alarm set to get you up again. Then you are woken twice in that window because something needs 2 people on deck. Do that once and you are tired. Do it for 2 days and you are somewhere else entirely. And the distribution is not even. Sleep researchers describe the effect of accumulated deficit as roughly linear and unforgiving. The shortfall does not reset when the weather improves, it compounds. By day 3 of gale conditions, a crew is not operating at day 1 capability minus a bit. They are operating in a state that, measured against the standards applied to anyone driving a lorry or flying an aircraft, would legally prohibit them from working. Now add competence distribution. 2 of the 3 were paying crew. That does not mean they were useless, but a skipper who is the only person aboard who can properly handle the boat in a gale does not really get off watch. He rests near the companionway, and he comes up every time something changes, which means the person whose judgment matters most is the person with the least sleep. That is structurally true on almost every short-handed boat, and it is close to a designed-in flaw in the way cruising is done. Now run that for 48 hours. What that produces is a specific and well-documented condition, and the aviation and maritime worlds both have a name for it. Fatigue is not tiredness. Fatigue is a measurable degradation of judgment, reaction time, and risk assessment that behaves, functionally, like intoxication. Severely fatigued people make characteristic errors. They lose the ability to project forward in time. They fixate on the present state and cannot model that conditions will improve. They lose the capacity to construct alternative plans. They become disproportionately risk-averse about the situation they are in, and simultaneously careless about the risk of the action they take to escape it. And they seize on any available exit. 3 men had been thrown around inside a snap-rolling hull for 2 days, in December, off Cape Hatteras, in a gale, with fuel running down, and one of them carrying the whole boat. The storm had, in fact, already begun to ease. By Thursday morning, the wind was down to 20 knots. They could not see that, because a fatigued brain cannot see forward. It can only see now, and now had been horrible for 48 hours. That is not cowardice. That is a physiological limit being reached, and it is the same limit that puts airline crews on mandatory rest and truck drivers on tachographs. There is one more element, and it is the one the sailing press pressed hardest on, so it deserves a fair hearing. Several commentators pointed out that a crew in that situation has an option that costs nothing, and that a great many cruising sailors have never actually practiced. Heaving to. Heaving to means setting the sails against each other, head sail backed one way, mainsail and rudder the other, so the boat stops fighting forward, and instead sits at an angle to the seas, drifting slowly sideways, making very little way. Done properly, a well-found yacht in a gale goes from a bucking, screaming, hand-steered nightmare to something close to still. The motion eases dramatically. The noise drops. The slick of disturbed water the boat leaves to windward actually knocks the tops off approaching waves. And critically, everybody can sleep. That is what makes it the direct answer to the problem that actually sank this voyage. Heaving to does not fix weather. It fixes exhaustion. It converts an unsurvivable watch system into a situation where 3 people can shut the hatch, eat something hot, and get 6 hours each while the boat looks after herself. Whether Yacht's crew tried it or knew how is not established anywhere I can find, and I am not going to assume. What is established is that it came up repeatedly in the professional commentary afterwards as the thing that would have changed the outcome. And there is a bitter symmetry in that, because heaving to is exactly the technique the 1979 Fastnet inquiry pushed back into the sport, for exactly this reason. The Coast Guard, notably, did not criticize them. The Coast Guard turned up, took them off, and went home. That is what it is for. Now the part that closes this whole series. Because this channel arrived at a rule twice, from opposite directions, and Yacht is the case that tests it. In 1979, in the Fastnet race, 24 crews abandoned their yachts in a storm off the southwest of Britain, and 19 of those abandoned yachts were later found still floating. 15 men died, overwhelmingly in the water, out of life rafts that came apart off the sides of rafts they were clinging to. The finding that came out of it and went into the sport permanently was that while a yacht is still afloat, the yacht is the life raft. 10 years later, John Glennie and 3 other men spent 119 days inside an upturned trimaran in the Southern Ocean and came home alive, and Glennie has spent the decades since telling anyone who will listen the same 3 words: stay with the boat. Yacht is that rule with the outcome inverted, and it is worth being precise about why. Those men left a floating boat and lived, every one of them, not a scratch. Because the difference between 1979 and 2024 is not seamanship. It is the helicopter. In 1979, leaving your yacht meant getting into a canvas and rubber raft in a storm and waiting, possibly for a very long time, in the actual sea. The raft was the alternative to the boat, and the raft was worse. That is why the rule exists. In 2024, 154 miles off North Carolina, leaving your yacht meant being winched into a Jayhawk and being on dry land for lunch. The alternative to the boat was not a life raft. It was a helicopter with a rescue swimmer and a hoist, and an HC-130 overhead and a cutter en route. So the Fastnet rule has not been repealed. It has been quietly modified by range and equipment. Inside helicopter range of a well-resourced Coast Guard, in daylight, the calculus genuinely is different, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But 2 things follow, and they are the real lesson of this case. The first is that this only works where the helicopter can reach you. Push that same crew, that same exhaustion, and that same decision out to the middle of the Atlantic, 1,000 miles from anywhere, which is where their planned route was taking them, and there is no Jayhawk. There is a life raft, and there is the Fastnet arithmetic, and the boat they left would have been the safest object within 500 miles, They were 3 days into a voyage whose route would have taken them far beyond rescue. The failure mode that got them at day 3 does not improve at day 30. It gets worse. The second is the cost, and it is not really financial. A Hercules, a Jayhawk, and a cutter were committed to this. Rescue swimmers went into a 10-foot sea. Every one of those assets was, for the duration, unavailable to whoever else needed it that morning, and the air crews took on the risk of a hoist in a seaway, which is one of the more dangerous routine operations in aviation. That is not an argument that they should not have called. It is an argument for the thing that would have prevented the call. Enough crew, enough rest, enough fuel, and a passage plan that treats human endurance as a consumable resource with a finite quantity, exactly like diesel. Because Yacht did not run out of boat. She was fine. She was still there. They ran out of people. I want to end this series on the men who flew out. The Jayhawk crew from Air Station Elizabeth City launched into a December morning off Cape Hatteras to hoist 3 strangers off a boat that from the air did not look like it needed anybody hoisted off it. There is no evidence that any of them said a word about that. They flew out, they put a swimmer down, they took 3 men up, and they brought them home. That is the job, and the job does not include an opinion about whether you deserved the call. Nobody died. In a series of 10 videos, in which a very great many people did, this one ends with everybody alive, which is the outcome the whole apparatus exists to produce, and it worked exactly as designed. Thomas Hagspiel lost his boat and got a very public verdict from people who were not there, in weather they did not experience, at the end of days they had not been awake for. Whatever anyone thinks of the decision he made at 3 in the morning, off the graveyard of the Atlantic, he made it while he was the most tired he had probably ever been, with 2 other men's lives in his hands, and he chose the option where all 3 of them lived. The boat was worth $225,000. It is not obvious to me that he got that trade wrong. What is obvious, and it is the thing this whole series keeps arriving at from every direction, whether the year is 1979 or 2024, whether the boat is a trimaran or a super yacht, is that the sea almost never kills people quickly. Look back across the 10 stories in this series, and the pattern is almost monotonous. 4 men on a delivery yacht spent 2 days watching water rise in a bilge and could not find where it came from, because it was coming up around the keel bolts. 2 days of slow, unexplained wrongness before the end. 15 men died in a single night off Ireland, but the fleet had been in building weather for a day and a half first, and the fatal decisions were made by people who had already been beaten up for 36 hours. 7 people on an 85-year-old schooner sent a message saying their storm sails had shredded and they were down to bare poles. That message describes a crew who had already been fighting for days. 4 men on an upturned trimaran lived 119 days precisely because they treated the problem as a long one and built systems for it, instead of making a fast decision on day 1. A woman went on deck at night with no life jacket, no harness, and no beacon, on the last leg of a month-long passage, when everybody aboard was tired and nearly home. A 68-year-old skipper went forward in breaking surf without a life jacket at the end of a night of fighting a storm at anchor. And 3 men on a perfectly sound 59-footer flew away from her in improving weather because they had run out of the one supply nobody had counted. Not one of those is a story about a wave. Every one is a story about accumulation. It wears them down first. It takes the sleep, and then the judgment, and then the options, one at a time, until the decision that ends it looks, from inside, like the only one left. Yacht was still floating. That was never the problem.